Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for ATT&CK's MITRE System of Trust, Supply Chain Assessment Synergy Consistency, and Evidence-Based Presentation. This webinar was put together by the Supply Chain Risk Management Working Group as the fourth event in their series. ATT&CK, which stands for Advanced Technology Academic Research Center, is a nonprofit organization that facilitates collaboration between government, industry, and academia in order to accelerate technology modernization initiatives. There will be an opportunity for questions and comments at the end of the presentation, so please share your questions in the chat. The slides will be numbered, so if there's a particular slide that you'd like to reference, please also include that in your question. So with that, I would like to pass it on to Bob Martin, our speaker for today's event.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to talk about some of the things that MITRE is doing in supply chain with many of you and others in the community. I'll try to just move along so we have time to talk about this in Q&A, but just to level set, everyone understands that supply chains, in one example, start with harvested or manufactured chemicals capabilities, and then you have intermediate goods that go through some production, creation process, and then they go through a distribution process to the consumer, to the customer, and then often there's a disposal phase. And the reason it's a challenge is because of the international nature of most of those supply chains. So you have raw goods, intermediate goods, and final goods moving around the world in a very economical way with the amount of shipping capacity the world has. So if we look at this as a pattern, you can kind of simplify it. You have materials following some design, production, distribution, and customer. And that pattern actually you can see in many types of supply chains. You can see it in the microelectronics supply chain, where they have a little different things that they're bringing together, but they have those different phases. Similarly, software supply chain. You have things that are following a design through some production process, distribution, and out to the customer. And even for things like fish, you harvest it, you land it, you package it, distribute it, and it gets out to the consumer through some mechanism. So the other thing that's been going on as we have all experienced supply chains in our lives is that the way computers are in our lives has changed. Used to be there were something you had to deal with at business, it was a back room or maybe your desktop. Now computers are in all parts of our lives. They're just embedded in many different things. And at the same time, the way we created software has changed from scratch built, where you basically wrote most of the software, to assembly, where 85 to 90% of most applications come from frameworks, libraries, modules that they reuse. And the consequence of that is a failure in this type of system now can have impact on people, on property, and it's no longer a matter of just, restoring from backup. So, and these are some examples of those industries. So when people talk about supply chain, often they focus first on that adversary. I've got to worry about the attacker. I want to offer that we also need to be considering the unintentional acts where people make poor quality, happenstance, weather issues happen, because these will take down your business just as surely, and they also open the door to the bad actor. So when I talk to people and say, well, how do you get about the list of things you're going to manage when it comes to supply chains? I usually see two modes. One is They have a blank sheet of paper and they start writing down the things that they're worried about or that they've heard about. And the unfortunate thing is they use their own way of capturing that, and they have to then educate and show people what they mean by that. The other way is they borrow from another project. And the trouble with this is that often that other project has different consequences. It's a different context. It's maybe even a different industry, different aspects of their effort. And so you end up changing out everything that you borrowed from the other project. Again, a lot of time spent in connecting and correcting. I think everyone agrees that supply chain risks predominantly are coming from third party, and the third party risk management is a foundational part of supply chain risks. However, most people don't understand the details and subtleties underneath it. Also, they aren't considering attackers, counterfeits. They aren't really paying attention to natural disasters and hazards, although these days that seems to be more of an attention getter for most companies. And they often don't think about the human hazards and how those could be impacting their supply chain. So what System of Trust is trying to do is give everyone a common, well thought out, structured starting point of what are the risks you may need to manage. So we're trying to collect everything we can find that talks about and depicts a supply chain risk, whether that be from the supplies, suppliers, services, just get them all together. Now, if we only did that, we'd totally fail, because you can't actually apply all of those risks. So we also need a way to come up with a subset that's appropriate for your particular business or type of transaction or question you're trying to answer. And so we have these profile idea that gets you a subset of the system of trust. So the basic, building blocks, as I may have intimated, is the supplier risks, supply risks, and service risks. And we've broken that down into 14 top level categories. Now, you won't see us promoting a risk score, because if somebody is really in good financial state, but offers up counterfeit product, you don't average those together. One of them is a showstopper. And so you need these different kind of columns of risk to be able to come to the top. What are some examples? Well, in financial stability risks, here's the subsets. So there's a lot of rich information out there in the financial area. So there's a lot we can do with that. In the other areas, organizational effectiveness risks, this is getting at, how is the organization structured? Where are they geographically located? And what geographical and geopolitical risk that brings to bear. Then there's things like external influence, in their ownership and the way they control any foreign business relationships or any adverse corporate influences. So a lot of things there. And then here's an example of ethical risk, companies not adhering to business practice, gets lawsuits, it's sanctioned, it's debarred, all those kinds of things. And then just an example in the hygiene area, could be there's resilience or security or just quality risks in writ large. And these go down a lot deeper. So, and there's things kind of tucked in there, like forced labor, green trade, sustainability, maybe a little bit in supplier organizational effectiveness and a little bit in the ethical risks. So some concepts that people talk about may not quite perfectly align to this structure, but the material's in there. So this is one way of looking at this collection. You're now looking at the first 3 levels of the system of trust. And what I just showed you are the ones that I just circled there. But in truth, it's a much deeper, much bushier set of concepts. But the center of it is what we think is what most people should be trained on, learn about, and use as a backbone of their discussion about supply chain issues. But the meat of what we've put together is based on a data model. So all of these different concepts are captured or connected. There's information about them and how they interact. And in fact, we have a content management tool that we built that's a cloud native application that is letting us to build and manage this. And this is where that profiling is actually implemented, in that you can come into the tool, look at everything, and then pull it, decide on a subset by clicking things in and out of scope. We also will have some profiles already created, but that's one of the big things we're going to be asking with industry, is to help us create these profiles of what are the risks that particular kinds of business or particular types of decisions require. Then you can also export this into a spreadsheet once you've created that subset, because you may not want to do the assessment out in a public area. In fact, you probably don't want to. So then you can go do the scoring off on your own enclave in your own area. So we've been piloting this, many different attempts, and we're still piloting it. And one of the things we've been definitely paying attention to is, how do you present the results? How do you make sure that if there's that one question out of the 50 that is, a very bad negative, and it's one of those showstoppers, if that happens, you can't, continue, how does that rise to the top? So we're trying to bake that into the way we offer presentations and so on. So to summarize, we have a data model. It's being used to build the basics of the system of trust, which is a hierarchy of the risks that come from suppliers, supplies, and services. You go into that material from a particular context, and when you do that, you get a subset of system of trust, which then you can assess against. If you have a different context, you get a different subset, and then you can evaluate against that. So let's zoom in a little bit to what are some examples of how you would really use this. So this is a company we looked at for one of the projects, and you can see the midnight and the 6 o'clock axis have been plotted to 0. So if you look at the top right, you can see the sub criteria for that midnight axis are all green. And these are measurements using data that's out in the public, or can be found in commercial offerings. And the actual metric then was translated to a stoplight chart. The bottom, you can see on the bottom left, the one criteria under supplier susceptibility was also green. But you can see there's yellows and reds in many of the others. And so this is just giving you an example. There's no weighting of these criteria. Nothing is more important than anything else. In a real situation, you would be giving your risk tolerance into these so that it reflected your concerns and which things you're more sensitive to. So, a big part of this now is going to be, how do I actually get the data to give those kinds of measures? So, if you look at the system of trust corpus, there's a lot of risks that we talk about that people have been assessing. And so one example is TIA Quest Forum's Supply Chain Security 9001 standard, and it's got 99 some odd requirements. And we're working with them to map those requirements to the risks that those requirements seem to address. So that if you're meeting their standard, that means you've done things to mitigate and manage some of those risks. And so we want to be able to take a product or a company that has been assessed against this and bring that insight into the system of trust assessment. So if you are doing an assessment of a company or a product and you know it's met this standard, we hope you'll be able to just click, yes, they met that standard, and that'll bring in all of the things that that implies, so that when you do the assessment, you have that data available to help you with your judgments. We're also looking to do this with IEC 62443, which is very common in the control systems world, and also with IEC 20243, which focuses on maliciously tainted and counterfeit products. It's an open group standard that's also an ISO standard. So that's another part of this. How do we get a consistent, reproducible, trendable set of measures for products and services and supplies, or some mixture of them? So we think that, you know, having this common way of looking will solve some of the problem of how do these different aspects connect and communicate. And, you know, we hope you can get involved and help build this content, find out, you know, with us how to measure these and how to bring it together. But I want to dig deep on one, you know, aspect of this. So if you look at a software supply chain, you know, there are things that can go wrong. That's why we're trying to manage the risk. So the Linux Foundation effort called Supply Chain Levels for Software Artifacts, SALSA, they've been looking at this, and they've identified many places where the software flow can be interrupted and disrupted and tainted. And so they've been doing this to build a way of asking for assurance against those attacks. So they have SALSA 1, 2, 3, 4 that each, you know, address is meant to say I'm addressing or I'm requiring you to address some mix of these. But what I want to do is use the actual attacks and risks to the product line that they have come up with. So if you bring these across to that software supply chain, you have them in a lot of different places. But if I'm going to gain assurance, I need some evidence and somebody to say, here's evidence that this is not happening and here's why. So there's a lot of places in the software development lifecycle, no matter which model you're following, where you can get this kind of data. So the question is, how can I get that kind of knowledge from deep in the proprietary approach companies are building products to make supply chain judgments? So the SCITT, the Supply Chain Integrity, Transparency, and Trust effort, it's an IET effort that is looking at this software supply chain and basically has the concept of a registry that can have policies and evidence. And the idea here is that when it comes to those risks, the ones that you're worried about, you can put in policies about what you need to know that will convince you that a risk did not appear at a particular stage or part of a supply chain activity. So here's some examples that we've put together. These will be much more robust for real software development, process. But then you can see that, well, okay, if I need to show that all commits have been signed by approved developers, then I need evidence that supports that. So I can have put onto the ledger a claim that I have that, and that I can point to the evidence. And so that would then meet that policy gate. Then for the next, I may need, to bring evidence from the build effort and so on. So the idea here is whatever the criteria is you have that you about assurance of things happening or not happening, you can put that in as policy statements in terms of claims and evidence that you need. And then when somebody brings that into their claim about a product, then you can see that product is fulfilling what you needed. So this could happen as well for microelectronics, because they have many attacks that can happen against their work. And so if we put them in, you can see that same idea of capturing those. What do you need to know that something didn't happen, or to gain assurance that something did happen? And what is the evidence that you want them to be able to demonstrate? Now, these are SCITT ledgers that these actual manufacturers, these producers would be running. It's basically keeping track of the details of how they built their product. These are not open, sitting on their website. They're part of their way of doing their business. But the idea is that when a customer or an auditor or somebody needs access to that data, you could give view access to the parts of it that they need to understand to, fulfill their interest about assurance. And by doing this as a standard way, it doesn't matter who comes and needs the access. There'd be a standard way of offering that and retrieving it, so that no matter which supply chains you're involved in, you can have a standard way of getting to this kind of information. And so in the seafood area, they also have things that can go wrong, that you want to gather evidence that they're not going wrong, or that certain things did happen. And so again, you can put that as criteria, and then you can gather the evidence that, the fish were caught and landed and shipped within the legal definition of fresh, if that's the criteria, that the hold was at proper temperature, that the fish kept at temperature through the loading and distribution, retail process, whatever the criteria is, we can articulate it and the evidence and claims against it. So at the heart of SCITT, it's basically the notary concept. And the notary, in our physical world, they don't look at the contract you're signing. They're not saying anything about that. They're basically just witnessing that who you are and that you've signed it. So here we can have claims. SCITT doesn't care what the claim is. We do want to structure the claims, and that's outside of SCITT, so that, if somebody makes a claim about testing that they did, you want to be able to understand the way they said that. We also don't want people making claims against other people's repositories unless it's an appropriate thing. So there's policies about who can write to the registries and what kinds of things they can do there. And then there's the actual registry itself, as well as a receipt, which is a Merkle tree based capability that will be usable and shows proof of the claim being registered, even if you don't have access to the registry. So the players of this story are documented in the IETF SCITT repository. These are the different roles that we've identified, and we talk about what they each would be able to do. But I wanted to kind of step back from these producer-specific registries and talk about a marketplace registry. So basically the idea here, let's say I'm a supermarket and I have a criteria for green products, leafy spinach, lettuce, and so on. And therefore I can write a policy about, they need to be from a certified, harvester who has trained, people and has health records and so on. And all that can be written as policy. And then the producer, the farm, they can basically, have inspectors, have people, make claims about what was done as they produce their spinach, and somebody can endorse, yep, all these things are being met, and that can be put in the registry. And so the idea would be is if somebody in your purchasing department at your store tries to buy that product, then it will automatically check what is your policy and are the requisite information and claim and evidence all there, and then authorize the transaction. So that's, it's a step away from the gory details, but the endorsed material can be made in a public available place so that people can make decisions using it. So here are the players that we're working with in the architecture. It's meant to be very concise because there's going to be a lot of data. So we want this as tight and as small as possible. We want to have identities that are easy to use and verify. And we also want those identities to be able to be reinforced. So many identities are only valid for a certain period of time, yet we want to be able to look at a SCITT ledger for decades. So how do you, determine that Bob was making a claim and he was a valid person to make that claim when he made it? Well, the idea is that we can endorse claims for validity of the identities. So using the ledger itself to give life to things that would normally have expired. So lots of discussions. We are pleased, if you're interested in this, come join us. We have weekly meetings. There's material out on our website on the meetings and the charter. The next in-person meeting is in Japan coming in March. A lot of people, including myself, will be doing it virtual, but welcome to join us there. So to summarize some of this, a lot of people are responding to the executive order 14028 part 4, which talks about SBOMs and attestations, and NTIA and the Department of Commerce put the minimal elements of SBOMs, and the NIST has kind of the building blocks of attestations about software, and OMB has put out a memo about how agencies and departments will be requiring these in their procurements. And so I wanted to kind of round this discussion out of software supply chain with just a couple words about SBOMs. They're a key part of this. The material from NTIA goes into depth what the minimal elements are. There's a couple different efforts out in the community, SPDX, Cyclone DX. SWID is discussed, but is really not appropriate for the role SBOMs are going to be taking. So I would suggest you look at the first two. And there's also now discussions about hardware bills of material. This is in the ICT SCRIM task force, shepherded by DHS and industry consortiums from the IT sector and the comm sector. So a lot of things to go there, but when we think about SBOMs, don't just think about it as a contractual requirement you need to do because somebody asked for it. If you're an organization receiving SBOMs, what you really should start thinking about is how you could use SBOMs to make your acquisition and activities clearer and more concise, to validate what's being offered and what's being proposed. You also can use it in how you manage your assets. It's giving you much finer granularity about what is it that the software on your devices is running and what it could be exposed to. Then you have a whole area of policy where you could start using SBOMs to give very concise, implementable approaches to meeting those policies. And then, of course, in vulnerability management, that's one of the things that people have been looking for SBOMs to help with, is to understand when software that's in my software, how do I know when it's got a vulnerability? And so look to see the vulnerability management tools also should be leveraging this much richer data as it comes available. And then incident response. If you have an organization that has understanding of the bills and material of your devices and systems, when something comes up, you can very quickly understand what systems are vulnerable and what you need to do to mitigate and put in where you should focus your patching if need anything. Then there's the whole understanding what threats are out there and being able to look at the right sources of that because you understand the targets you're defending. And then there's things about deployment where you're trying to make a decision about deploy. Well, what things precisely are you deciding you want to deploy, and what are the status of all of those? There's also continuous monitoring can definitely benefit from SBOMs, as well as licensing and legal concerns about, is all the software I'm getting appropriately licensed and I'm not being put at risk because of something somebody put into the product that they're selling to me. And then finally, just, organization or agency to supplier, a lot of clarity can be added into that discussion by bringing in SBOMs. So this is kind of putting those all together. Something I haven't seen a lot of people talking about is these other aspects. And there's some papers out there. The first three MITRE put together talking about some of these aspects. The Atlantic Council has also got a good paper that they put out recently that I recommend. So to summarize it, when you talk about supply chains, it's not just raw material being processed and then distributed and put into use. There's a lot of information about those activities that we need to know, that we need to share both with the end consumer, but also amongst the players in the supply chain, because somebody can't make statements to a customer if they don't have the information to base that on. So I've been doing a lot of talking about these aspects. Here's kind of a cliff notes of a lot of them. I've also had the opportunity to talk to many in the executive branch, as well as many different parts of Congress about this. Not something I used to do, but it's interesting to get their perspective and share our thoughts on it. We do now have a community of practice around system of trust, and these are the current companies that have gotten permission to be listed. Expect this to grow, but these are people that are helping us evolve the system of trust risk categories. How do you measure these? How do you know that they're existing? How do you weight them? And all the different aspects beyond that. Some of those companies also offer information about supply chains, and either through standards or as a service that they offer. And we're looking at mapping what they cover to System of Trust, so that they may be able to say, if you're interested in System of Trust, here's the following risk factors that I have data available for, if you would like to procure it from us. So we think of that as a compatibility, where they can talk System of Trust terms and concepts, and maybe output a report in terms of System of Trust, and definitely have queries about, can you give me data about this risk factor? So the other companies that are involved in the community are helping us, build out certain aspects of that content. And so here's 3 buckets of it. There's others, but these are where we're getting their help. But before I finish, I wanted to offer that there are definitely things that System of Trust is not. So it's not a magical database of these things. It is not a risk management or a logistics management or even a cyber risk management approach. It is a complement to those. It's the what risks do I want to manage following these other guidances. So we think it's widely adoptable, tailorable, and a way to bring data to that risk management practice. And it's a nexus of many things and many efforts in the community. And we're seeing a lot of interest and a lot of synergy. So the building blocks that we've been using, that I'm talking about, is the catalog itself, the System of Trust. We have the risk model manager is our content manager. We have the community. We have a public website. We already have a version of the risk model manager that's out and available for people to get accounts for. And we want to build that into a art of the possible demonstrator, so people can learn what's possible to do and where you can get data. And then I talked about the compatibility program. The one I haven't mentioned is we also see a need for a standard way of giving people insight to a supply chain. So, if you do have a supply chain and somebody says, well, what is your supply chain? I need to have confidence. There's no standard way of representing a supply chain or the different aspects of it. And we see that as a crying need in the community. And so we're going to be trying to help bring a standard around that. So the goals that are driving all of this, and I'll be sharing these slides shortly, so you can have it to look through in detail, are these. So these are what are driving us. We're not near hitting all of these, so we definitely love your input and help us evolve this. We're going to have a couple different ways of making this available. I've implied some of them. This is just another way. So the RMM tool itself, after we get it matured a little bit, we'll be making it available open source, so people could make use of it in their own enclave. It's a AWS cloud native application, but it's totally infrastructure as a service, so that you can build it, compile it, install it, and all through the material that we've prepared. So to wrap it all up, we've been doing a lot of reach out, publishing about this. We have a website. If you want to ask questions about it, SOT@MITRE.org is a good place. If you don't remember my email, which is ramartin@mitre.org. But with that, I have 20 minutes for questions.
So Jim Payne had a few questions and I will, that he put in the chat, but I will go ahead and unmute Jim so he can ask them to the group.
Sure.
Let me find you really quick, Jim. Okay, Jim, you're off mute.
All right, unmute. Sound check. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
We can hear you.
Yeah, very nice presentation. OMB and the administration in that same executive order that you referenced put a lot of emphasis on machine-to-machine identity management.
Yep.
Means of accomplishing zero trust architecture. It strikes me in your presentation that this could also be one of the tools that can be used to sort of close in on finding the enemy on the backbone. What we worry about is not just while it gets into the backbone, that's always bad, but when you later find out that that same entity or a piece of equipment has been there for 5 years, that's just a lot of problems with our whole approach to this. I just want to see if you agree that this machine-machine identity management could also help with the overarching issue with supply chain risk management. Over.
No, I think, we've often focused on, product acceptance and not looked at how the product was made and the machines that made it, what they were running, and the design tools, and were they secure. And so we're basically got these different layers of the onion that we need to start having a reason to trust. So, another way of saying it is we want trustworthy. We want to have an understanding of why it's worthy of trust. And so that's definitely another aspect of this.
Since it has become regrettably a bit of a buzzword, I think that helps all of us when we're talking about supply chain risk management, that we feather in this concept of not only CTA, but some of that work actually is very compatible with this larger problem. I did submitted two. May I ask the second question as well? I don't want to hog the
Sure.
It strikes me, having worked on this for most of my career, it seems, that the enemy seems to know how to find the weakest link, probably at the fifth and sixth level of supply chain tiers, and then just the kind of vendor that they could slip underneath of. They're very clever about this. And because most companies are not managing this in the way it could be done, they just seem to have no problem getting into these backbones. Can you speak to how this might help with that?
Well, in fact, that's one of our big reasons for doing this. We think that, at MITRE, being a not-for-profit running federally funded research and development centers, definitely, our focus is helping our sponsors in the federal government. But to do that, we think industry to industry is the key to this. And that if the industry, as due diligence of managing your business, you don't have a good grounding of what supply chain risks you should be addressing, there's no way you can add it in at the end.
Oh gosh, no.
Yeah.
It's like hiring an architect once you've built your house. It's like too late, right?
All they can do is tell you how to rebuild
it down.
So, if we can get people to learn about supply chain risks, to consider them as they make decisions, then that will propagate a more in-depth and more consistent view of what are the supply chain risks that are occurring. I think a lot of black swans occur, and they're not really black swans to the community. They're just black swans to individuals because they didn't realize that 87 people got that last quarter. And, the fact they're getting it, they should have been paying attention, but that's a little harsh.
Well, this is a very noble journey, and I would love to see SecureG which is funded and founded by MITRE Ingenuity, to play a role in this, because we're deeply invested in this in this issue of machine-to-machine identity management. Over.
Okay.
Do we have,
I haven't engaged that aspect of MITRE in this work. But it's on.
Charles Clancy.
Yeah, no, I know Charles.
Yeah, of course you would. Of course you would. He's the chairman of the board of SecureG.
Right, and he's well aware of system of trust. I just haven't had that connection.
Well, I'll help you link it. I'm composing something for him right now.
Okay.
Let's see if we can mutually corral that one.
Okay, sounds good.
do we have any other questions? We can either put it in the chat or if you wanted to raise your hand, I can unmute you.
Everybody was overwhelmed by all the different parts of what I talked about.
Oh, we do have one hand raised. Let's see. John Kavanaugh, here we go.
Hi, Robert.
Yes.
Oh, let's unmute you again. Sorry about that, John.
Heard you for a moment.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, this is a great presentation. I've been in supply chain probably close to 30 years, and most of my more recent time has been in around software. So we've been working with a number of innovative solutions. Some of it you've mentioned. One that we're focusing on now is around a SBOM equivalent, which we're calling an RBOM, a release bill of materials. And I was just wondering, in your research, have you come across that type of topic before?
Actually, you brought up something that just is maturing out of so these days the government through CISA, which is part of DHS, has taken over the government leadership of trying to coordinate work on bombs, and Alan Friedman and some of the other resources that were originally at NTIA have moved over to CISA. And one of the working groups that they've stood up is a tooling working group, and the paper, it's I think 2 pages that they are just about to publish, is actually talking about the fact that there are actually, I think, 6 different kinds of SBOMs. There's a design SBOM where you can capture what you are planning to do. There's the development SBOM, which knows of all the different modules and pieces. Then there's the build SBOM, which is what actually was built, out of all those options from the development environment. Well, how did you actually, which things did you actually include and how? There's a runtime SBOM, and I think there's one other, I can't remember, I'm sorry. But they're trying to articulate these and capture their differences. And it sounds like you ought to engage them and synergize with that, because I think there's a great meeting that going on there that's definitely, a lot of people in the open source world will be talking about the development bomb, but a lot of people, get something delivered to them and they then install it. And they want to talk about, how it got configured and which libraries actually got installed versus were on the distribution. But other people want to know, well, what was it distributed and what was made available.
Right.
So there's going to be some more specific vocabulary about the kinds of bombs that are available, and what are they being used for and envisioned for.
Okay, well, we can, I'll certainly reach out to you and we can link up with your effort, and I'll try to reach out to Alan as well.
Yep.
We're also participating with ATT&CK on the software factory. So there's, I guess, a triangulation perhaps we can do.
That
to-
sounds great.
Sure.
I'm sure Alan will be jazzed to find some additional energy out there that can help this, because it's a daunting set of problems.
Yeah, it is. And we're coming in with some new novel technology as well. So perhaps
Cool.
that'll make it a little easier.
Okay, I'm glad to hear it.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions, comments for Bob?
Well,
Brian? No, Brian's here. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I was just wondering, a lot of information today. Thank you so much. This has really been helpful. I was just wondering if you could paint a picture of a timeline of the maturation of the things you talked about today.
sure. So system of trust, I'll start with that. That's closest to my heart every day. We have a version 1 of our content that is out to the community that I showed you for comment and feedback and evolution. In fact, I've talked to 8 of those 20 in the last day about their comments, and so I'm expecting in the next couple of weeks to be get a bath of input on that. The version we have now is up and running in our infrastructure, and you saw it in the slides I presented. So we're already talking about it. And so we then will hope to, wrap that into an update. And we also hope to build out more functionality in that art of the possible prototype. I don't have a specific timeline for the tooling, but the content, I expect probably a couple of months, because you're getting 20 different sets of input and they're going to conflict. They're going to conflict. So we'll have to adjudicate that, probably set up some working groups to help people. I don't want them to just lob it over the door and have us have to figure out what they meant. English language is a wonderful way of expressing yourself and confusing others. But now SCITT is actually just announced a community around the standards work. So within IETF, they're working the standards. They've got a draft RFC that's progressing and getting more refined, but they've also now have a community that is building libraries that you can use to do some of the programming of some of the functions. They've got a proof of concept demonstration of some of the others already available, and they've got other pieces, in the pipeline. So there are people who are using early SCITT implementations to do their compliance to the executive order. So they, not only are they going to give a letter that, attests to things, but if people ask, they can go back and, lay it to the specific evidence to support those claims. So I think it's a little further along than the spec would, make you think. But, if the spec moves a different direction than it currently is, we'll have to update some of that material. But it's very energetic and making good progress. And I guess the only other one that I did mention So SPDX, I'm also involved in trying to mature that standard. And they currently have, I think, 2.3 is the version that's out and available. But version 3 has been under construction for 2 years, and it's just about to be available as a draft. And so that should be coming this spring.
Jim Payne did put one more question in the chat. So Jim, I'll go ahead and ask you to unmute if you want to ask that question. Or I can read it to the group. He said, oh, okay.
Had you, Robert, had you ever considered working, or have you been working with Dun & Bradstreet? They have some very unique data where they're tracking millions and millions of companies in China and looking at patterns of communication that might suggest supply chain. I know when I was there was a person in MITRE that was terribly interested in that. I just wanted to see if that's still ongoing.
Yeah, I mean, they are one of the organizations we think of as supply chain illumination or supply chain, data providers. I have not engaged with that particular organization yet, but they're on my to-do list. So if you have good contact information.
Well, I'm not certain that they do understand their important role. I'm speaking very candidly.
Oh, okay.
Because they just sit on top of this incredible collage of information that with artificial intelligence, you can discern an awful lot. I'm just going to leave it
Well,
right.
and some of that same data may be coming out in companies like Exeger and Interos, who also
They're very unique. They are very unique.
Okay.
Let's just leave it that way. I've asked Elizabeth to connect us up with contact information so we can possibly continue some of these conversations. I'm glad to make some intros for you.
Okay, I'd be glad to look at it and see which risks they can bring.
Yeah, I'm not with Dun & Bradstreet, but I spent a number of years there, and it's an asset that I don't think people quite know what to do with, including Dun & Bradstreet.
Okay,
I mean that,
well,
I mean that in the kindest way.
yeah, no, I'm well, and I think the articulation of the risks that we're doing in system of trust is going to help some of these kind of data mining companies. They have the data, but they don't necessarily know what things they should be looking for.
Right, correct.
So I'm hoping that, our set of risks could inspire them for things that they can go find. And if they have things that they're finding and already, revealing, then we may have risks we haven't included.
Yes. Well, this crisis is an all hands on deck. Whatever you have, let's throw it up against the wall, because the enemy is so darn clever, and that they're not encumbered by privacy, law, democracy. They're just doing anything they can, and we're somewhat at a disadvantage unless we do these creative sort of out of band things. That's my opinion.
No, it makes sense.
So Elizabeth, if you can send up to me Robert's
Yes,
contact.
I'll link you both up. So everyone, unfortunately, that is all the time that we have today. But Bob, again, we wanted to thank you so much for your presentation. I know everyone really enjoyed it. And thank you to our audience for joining us. And we hope to see you at the next ATT&CK event. So have a good day.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Very nicely done.
Thanks.